Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone to our Chappaqua Foreign Policy Discussion Group. We're now in our 24th year, which is now soon to wrap up for the year. So, in any case, we are excited to be here. We have a wonderful speaker who we are all dying to listen to. So, let me also introduce you to the other members of the discussion group who are responsible for putting these programs together for you. Amy Friedman, Naomi Marrow, Carolyn Resnick, and Tyler Beebe. So a great team, and as you know, we do have wonderful programs. We are now coming up on almost 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. We watched, I did, with sort of a certain amount of disbelief when we saw the Russian forces building up along the Ukrainian border before the invasion. And we saw a country that looked normal, just like ours, tree-lined cities, people walking along streets, open storefronts, really very much like our lives here in the US. However, thanks to journalists who've now been filming and reporting from Ukraine, we now see a very different country, one that is at war. We see buildings and towns that have been turned to rubble, hospitals filled with children and adults, men and women of all ages in uniform and not, using whatever weapons they have to protect their homeland, fighting in the Ukrainian countryside, its streets, and striking within Russia and on the seas. We've seen a small country that we saw no hope in resisting Russia's might carry the banner of freedom and democracy and wage a defiant and strategic battle against a leadership that seems bent on subjugating Ukraine, no matter its own costs of lives, present and future economic growth. Against that, we've seen our own country under Trump waver in its support from castigating and threatening Ukraine and Europe while praising and seemingly favoring Putin. More recently, however, Trump has focused more effort on resolving the Ukraine-Russia war, with almost now daily announcements of peace being within reach. While there is no crystal ball, can we be hopeful that, in fact, a resolution of this war is near? To give us insight into what is at stake for the various players, including Europe, and what we might expect in the next few weeks, we cannot have a more seasoned and knowledgeable speaker before us than Evelyn Farkas. And before I turn our program over to Naomi Marrow, our hostess, to introduce our speaker, let me do a little housekeeping. Our speaker will speak for 35 minutes, and then we will continue with questions from our panelists and from you, our viewers, with a hard stop at 11:15. Please enter your questions into the chat tab at the bottom of the screen. And as you know, our program is being recorded and will be archived for on-demand viewing on the Chappaqua Library website under Events and Foreign Policy. You can also find us on Google. And now to our speaker, Naomi.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome back for a return visit Dr. Evelyn Farkas, aka Evelyn. She is the head of the John McCain Foundation. She has extensive background in Eastern Europe from the U.S. and the military. She has been the president of the Farkas Global Strategies Organization, a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the U.S., and the Atlantic Council and National Security contributor to NBC, MSNBC. She was for 3 years Deputy Assistant Secretary for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, also covering neighboring countries in the Balkans, Caucasus, and handling conventional arms control. Before that, she was a senior advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe and special advisor to the Secretary of Defense for the NATO summit. I can go on and on. It gets continuingly impressive. She has, as I said, extensive background, is very knowledgeable, is a friend of the Foreign Policy Group and outstanding. Evelyn, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Naomi. Thank you to Joan and June. It means a lot to me to be back here at the Chappaqua Library. I grew up in Chappaqua. I have a photo of myself and my brother in front of the Chappaqua Library when it was still being built in the 70s, which also gives your audience a sense of how old I am. But the Chappaqua Library is a place that means a lot to my family. My father also was library director for 30 years of the Briarcliff Manor Public Library, sister library in the Westchester neighborhood, if you will. So libraries are important, and these kinds of programs are, of course, a key to making sure that people in Chappaqua get some awareness about foreign policy because it does impact our lives. It doesn't matter where you live, what's happening in Russia and Ukraine does matter and should matter to all the residents. Maybe you don't think about it day to day, but it will impact you. The outcome will impact you. So I thought it might be a good idea to go back a little bit and talk about what's at stake here, because ultimately, we've been watching this war play out, certainly in the very extreme phase. So from 2022, when Russia conducted its full frontal invasion, but really since 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine. And I think it bears a little bit of reminder, why is Russia doing this? What does Ukraine want? And then what are the stakes for us? So the Soviet Union, of course, collapsed in 1991. And under the Soviet system, there were republics. And Ukraine had an identity that goes back, of course, to antiquity, if you will. And the Ukrainian people had their own ethnic language, they had their own culture, they had their own, again, ethnicity. They had their own republic also under the Soviet system. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, one of the constituent republics was the Ukrainian was Ukraine, and so Ukraine became an independent state. The United Nations seat, and this is interesting because President Zelensky brings this up and now and then, President Zelensky being the president of Ukraine, he'll bring up the fact that at the end of the Cold War, the UN seat just went sort of almost automatically to the Russian Federation, to Russia and to Moscow. And the Ukrainians actually, as the second largest constituent member of the United or of the Soviet Union, had a little bit of a bickering. While again more recently, why did Russia get the Security Council seat in particular? So of course Ukraine became a member of the United Nations, but the Security Council seat went to Russia. So that's an interesting point, and I would only bookmark that. I don't know that Russia is in danger of losing its seat because it still is the largest constituent part of the Soviet Union. But in a future where we do reorganize the United Nations in terms of who gets to be seated at the Security Council, there could be a re-examination of that. Not that I think Ukraine would necessarily get the seat, but it is an interesting question. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine was, of course, became its own nation with its own government. And the Ukrainians started to embark upon democracy. And they, just like the other former Soviet states, including Russia, they had elections and they put a government into place. But Ukraine essentially had trouble with corruption really from the beginning and trouble really becoming a full-fledged democracy right from the start, which was not something most people expected anyway. The US and our allies, we spent a lot of time making sure that Eastern Europe became more democratic, that they instituted a real capitalist competitive economy. And by the time the Soviet Union fell apart, which was a little bit later, we weren't as interested and spending as much time and money on the former Soviet states. So Ukraine did get attention from the United States, but their democracy had a lot of flaws. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian people demonstrated really from the beginning a real desire to be fully democratic. And in that sense, the fact that the Ukrainians rose up in 2014 to assert themselves, and I'll get to that in a second, it actually has its roots all the way back to the beginning of the Ukrainian state, when the Ukrainians said, we would like to make sure that we have a real democracy, a real competitive economy. Again, they did struggle with corruption, they struggled with poor government, and ultimately, when the Ukrainian people became really fed up, they would demonstrate. So you had the Orange Revolution in 2004 rather, where the Ukrainians went to the streets and said, there were election irregularities, and they protested, and there was some sort of political correction. But ultimately, the Ukrainians continued, and the Russian government, the Kremlin, from essentially the beginning, but most egregiously from Putin's time in office. So he came to office in 2000. Prior to that, I should put a little asterisk here because Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, they were nuclear powered, if you will. They had nuclear forces on their territory when the Soviet Union fell apart. So all of those states, except for Russia, said we will relinquish our nuclear weapons, but in exchange, the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia would, in the case of Ukraine, but also probably Belarus, but in the case of Ukraine, they signed this Budapest Memorandum and they said that if any country attacks you, Ukraine, we will come to your aid because you no longer have the nuclear shield. We will come to your aid. Of course, we did not foresee that the Russian government, that the Russian military would be the one to attack Ukraine, and certainly the Ukrainians at that point in time could not imagine that as well. But that is what happened later. Putin came into office in 2000, and over time, he really developed a neo-imperial vision for the Russian Federation. He wanted to reconstitute the Soviet Union. He was not a real Democrat, so he pretended at it and held elections. But in essence, he said, I'm going to rule the Russian Federation, and I'm going to ensure that Russia regains control over the former Soviet states. And that in the beginning, that didn't have to be necessarily militarily. So he exercised economic blackmail, if you will, economic coercion, political interventions. And so Ukraine was, for a long time, essentially closely allied with Russia. And by 2014, the government in power in Ukraine was led by President Yanukovych, who was very close to Moscow. So he was a Russian friend, ally, if you will. But the Ukrainian people had become impatient. They wanted to become they wanted Ukraine to join the European Union. Why? Because they looked next door and they saw Poland. They saw that the Polish people were wealthier and better off, had more freedom, had a better economic system than Ukraine. And that was also uncomfortable for them because during the Cold War, Ukraine was stronger. Ukraine was seen as more powerful and the bigger brother, if you will. So the Ukrainian people said, we want to be like the Poles. And when Yanukovych, he kind of vacillated, he would hedge. He would say, "Well, we're going to join the EU maybe someday," but then Putin would say, "You can't join the EU." And ultimately, when he publicly decided that Ukraine wasn't going to join the EU just yet, the Ukrainian people went to the streets in 2014 and they demonstrated. They said, our government is not doing what we want. We want to join the European Union. We also want to join NATO, by the way, although that was not as firm an objective until later after the Russians invaded. They basically said that we don't want to be under the thumb of the Kremlin, the Ukrainian people. Yanukovych fired at the demonstrators. Over 100 were killed. And there was a crisis. The Yanukovych government essentially couldn't hold on to power anymore. Yanukovych was still in the country. And so the international community came in, literally flew in, and a European Union, United States, there was a Russian ombudsman, and they basically engineered a transition government of basically a coalition of opposition and Yanukovych that would govern until elections could be held, and they set up a date for elections. Yanukovych lost his nerve, though. He was worried that somehow, even after all this transition government, that he would be held to account for the deaths of those people, the demonstrators, and so he fled to Moscow. It was at that point that Putin realized, okay, my puppet guy isn't controlling Ukraine, and I need to go in there and reassert the Russian interests. And he maybe did have a real worry that somehow Crimea, which was hosting the Russian fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, also was hosting a Marine base and other bases for the Russians as well as the Ukrainians. Putin decided, I'm going to seize Crimea And so in 2014, he seized Crimea. It was the first time that any country, one country, had annexed another country's territory since Hitler annexed Austria during World War II. So this was an egregious break with international law. In addition to that, Putin started a war in the Donbas region, in another part of eastern Ukraine, and that low-level war continued. The Crimea invasion was so fast, and I was in the Pentagon at the time, that the international community and the Ukrainians really didn't have much of a chance to counter it. And it was a fait accompli before really anyone could figure out what to do. And the idea of seizing it back, it would have cost too many lives. However, in the Donbas, there were a lot of brave Ukrainians, mayors, and others who pushed these insurgents who were basically funded by the Russian secret intelligence services, the Russian military intelligence services, and they pushed them out of their territory. So a real war began there on the ground for control over Ukraine. At the United Nations, of course, the international community condemned this. It's important to note that China, while it's a complete ally of Russia, even when it comes to Ukraine, it did not recognize Russia's seizure of Crimea, the illegal annexation. So fast forward to 2022. Why did Putin invade? Why did Putin conduct the full frontal invasion? Because after he invaded in 2014, he was not able to reassert political control over Ukraine. Ukraine had first Petro Poroshenko, who was a kind of oligarch, chocolate magnate, media magnate, who ruled, who was the president for one term, or president, I believe it was for one term in Ukraine. And then he was succeeded by President Zelensky, who came into power saying, I'm going to make peace and I'm going to crack down on corruption. And the Ukrainians had been working hard on corruption internally, but it was still a problem. So the Russians re-invaded basically, or conducted another invasion, but a different one, this time going full frontal. The objective was to take all of Ukraine. They were headed towards Kyiv, but the Ukrainians fought back, and to the surprise of the entire international community, pushed Russia out of most of Ukraine, but not all of Ukraine. So the war obviously has been ongoing. But what was most shocking of this phase of the war was the way Russia conducted it. They basically picked up the playbook they had been using in Chechnya and in Syria, and they started bombing innocent civilians, bombing cities, hospitals, maternity wards. In the areas where the Russian military went in on the ground, they took people prisoner. They seized thousands of children and stole them, basically took them to Russia. In fact, the International Criminal Court has a warrant out for Putin's arrest because of that action. And in addition to that, there were tortures, rapes, horrendous human rights violations on a scale that really we haven't seen probably since World War II, although, of course, the Balkan Wars were also pretty brutal. So the Russians conducted this horrific war. They continue to target innocent civilians. They continue to, from the air, target with missiles and drones, target innocent Ukrainians. They are trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people. But as we all know, the Ukrainian people, for them, this war is existential. So I think this is probably where, I probably spent a little too much time on the ancient history, or the history from earlier in the 20th century. I think it's important to pause and think about the objectives here. What the Russian government wants is to reconstitute essentially the Russian Empire. And, I didn't mention that Putin also invaded Georgia, which is a country in the Caucasus, in 2008. This happened before the invasion of Ukraine. And Russia continues to occupy 20% of the Georgian territory. So Putin was already working on his imperial agenda as early as 2008, but we didn't understand that. The Europeans didn't understand that. And even after 2014, there was a thought that somehow Putin could be stopped, that there could be a bargain that would be made, some kind of truce. Russia had in the past, essentially satisfied itself with frozen conflicts, if you will, ceasefires. But this time, 2022 onward, we see that Russia has a maximalist objective, that Russia wants to control Ukraine. And it will do it militarily if, however, it can obtain control over Ukraine at the negotiating table. Russia will also like to do that. The Russian people, on the other hand, for them, while they generally support Putin, at least according to the polls, and we know this is not a real democracy, the war itself is not incredibly popular among the Russian people. Russia has had to pay people to fight, and they've more or less taken people from the Caucasus, from the Arctic areas, the minorities, the non-Russian, non-ethnic Russians, so Chechens, Dagestanis, and others, have been sent to the front. And the villages have been paid, and the families have been paid, but there's been an incredible toll that those communities have taken. And of course, we know that Russia, it appears, has a total of 1 million casualties, so injured or deceased. And in certain phases of the war, the more recent phases, they've been losing as many as 1,000 Russian soldiers a day just to get sort of some incremental gains on the battlefield. But I'll get to that in a second. So the bottom line is that for the Ukrainian people, they have not been, for them, it's not existential. And Putin has steered clear of doing a general mobilization. For the Ukrainian people, it's existential. They want the right to their sovereignty. They want the right to their Ukrainian state. They want the right to their own ethnicity, their language, their culture. And all of that now has been under attack during this, from 2022 onward, during this phase of Russia's attack, the brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. And many scholars actually believe it's reached the point where it's genocidal, where the Russians want to erase the Ukrainian people as an entity, and certainly the Ukrainian state. The Ukrainians have said we will fight to the last person, and I am convinced that even if Russia somehow were handed Ukraine on a silver platter, that if the United States and Europe caved, the Ukrainians would continue to fight a war of insurgency. So we're not looking at peace in Ukraine in our time until, frankly, the Russians are defeated, until the Kremlin realizes that this foreign policy is not going to yield success. So what is the so and essentially I should add what is at stake for us before I get into the state of play. What is at stake for us is nothing short of the international order. I mentioned already that this was the first annexation, the first alteration of borders using military force in Europe since World War II. There was one in the Middle East when Iraq entered Kuwait and seized Kuwait. And that was one of the rationales for the US going in 1991 and pushing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Because again, you cannot seize your neighbor's territory using military force, according to the United Nations foundational documents, United Nations Convention. So in essence, for us, it's the international order, because if Russia gets away with holding on to Crimea, if Russia gets away with seizing territory from Ukraine and holding on to it, then it will be a signal to other actors like China, like any other rogue state, frankly, even Hungary, which has designs on some of the neighboring territories surrounding Hungary that they lost in World War I. And we would be back to a sphere of influence system of government, which was what led us to World War I and World War II, where the larger states dictate what happens to the smaller states. Essentially, after World War II, we said we're just going to freeze the borders. Everyone should accept the borders. And once those borders are accepted, then the rulers, the governments that have now the safety, knowing that those borders won't be challenged, they have to make sure that there are minimal observance of human rights inside those states. And that was the bargain of the United Nations. That bargain has kept the United States, all of us, out of a third world war. And if we somehow allow this international order to crumble, if we say you can change borders and hold on to territory after you've annexed your neighbor's territory, then we are in a much more dangerous world. And frankly, the United States will not be isolated, because the bad guys know that we are still the largest economic, political, and military power, and they will come after us. They will try to weaken us. We cannot bargain with China and with Russia and say, just leave us alone here, because they know that we can counter them, and they don't want us to counter them. And in a world where there's no international order, where the strongest states dictate for the weaker states how they live their lives, what kind of political system they have, what kind of economic system they have, the United States then would be at risk that China or Russia would try to dominate us. And of course, we know that already from 2016 on, the Russian government has been quite aggressive in meddling with our political system. But China, Iran, North Korea have also joined, especially when it comes to social media and regular media, frankly, in the disinformation space. So I am mindful of time. I'm going to jump ahead now and say, okay, that's what's at stake for Russia, for Ukraine, and for the United States. Of course, for the Europeans, they are very worried that Putin will come after them next because the NATO alliance and the European Union includes three states, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And you heard me earlier say that Vladimir Putin would like to reconstitute the Russian Empire. Those countries are not safe and they know it. They're right on the border. And of course, you have other countries. Poland has a long history of having been invaded by Russia. So they are also nervous and there is no trust. And the Russian government has conducted for the last year so-called sabotage operations. And I frankly think they're attacks, including most recently two devices, two bombs that were set off on railroad tracks in Poland that are railroads that are used to provide military support to Ukraine. But there are also civilians using those railroads. And so, to my mind, Russia has actually started conducting small scale attacks against NATO allies. And that is a real problem, to say the least. NATO has not sufficiently deterred Russia from taking these actions. And in my estimation, I'm going to jump ahead and anticipate a question. We need to make sure that NATO communicates to the Russians that if they do this again, if they conduct these kinds of operations, and there's a whole list of them, you can Google them. I don't even have time to list everything, but these operations, these attacks on European countries, and to include, frankly, the U.S. installations in Europe, these attacks should be regarded as an article requiring an Article 5 discussion by allies about how they respond. And the allies should decide and communicate to Russia that if they continue these attacks, that they will be met with some kind of similar force, similar attack back from NATO. That's the only way to deter Putin. So, where are we now when it comes to the state of play with regard to Russia and Ukraine? Well, on the battlefield, it's pretty horrific. There's basically a stalemate. And I'm talking now about not Crimea, but the eastern part of Donbass. The Ukrainians were able to take back control of the Black Sea, so that's really important because they've been able to continue resume trade, and that happened probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago now. And that was a huge gain for them, and largely as a result of their undersea and in the air drone technology. And the Ukrainians have been incredibly inventive. And as I said, they have managed to open up the sea for themselves again. Where they haven't succeeded is on the battlefield, but neither has Russia. Again, these are incremental changes that they'll take one town and then lose one town, and none of these are strategic changes. I commend you to watch, though it's disturbing, a new documentary. I think you can find it on Netflix called Adivka. Sorry, my Ukrainian pronunciation. It gives you an example of how horrendous and how almost futile the war is on the ground. But having said that, the Ukrainians, though, as I mentioned, they opened up the Black Sea, and then they've also been using drones and long-range strikes to attack Russia in the rear, if you will. And this is where the Russian economy and the Ukrainian economy comes into play. The Ukrainians have started taking out Russian refineries and oil depots. And the significance of this is that so far it looks like about 20% of the Russian oil supply has been knocked out. If the Ukrainians continue this effort, they will be able to cripple the Russian military machine. We already know that the Russian people, that their access to oil has been impacted. There are long lines at gas stations, and the price of oil has gone up domestically. So these are ways the Ukrainians are actually conducting these strikes, unlike what's happening in the battlefield on the front. These strikes are actually operationally significant, and I would also say significant from a strategic perspective, because the Ukrainians might be able to actually put sufficient pressure on Russia to change the negotiating climate and make Russians, the military and the people, realize that they can't win this war, that the price is too high. So we need to make sure in the West that we provide Ukraine with the weapons that they need in order to hit the rear. They can get far with the drones, but the drones don't pack as much in terms of a bomb. So the bombs are smaller, and the Russians can continue on with their work, especially if it's a drone factory that they're targeting, unlike, of course, a refinery. So the the battlefield, as I said, is more or less stalled. Economically, though, Russia could be pressured further because the sanctions that we've imposed have been essentially circumvented all along by, to some extent, our European allies, but mostly by China and India. President Trump has put pressure most recently on India. The Senate has 82 senators who have signed on to a very stringent sanctions regime that would be put on any actors, any countries who purchase oil and gas from Russia. So these so-called secondary sanctions would be significant. Russia, their economy, the timing for this would be really good. The Europeans have been cutting down or clamping down on the so-called shadow fleet of oil tankers that are illegally taking Russian oil all around the world. So that's also a pressure point that's being exerted. And all of this together could continue to weaken and in fact cripple eventually the Russian economy. Why do I say this? Because Russia is struggling right now with inflation. The inflation has gone from about 8% to 6.8%, but the decrease has been because the Russians are spending less. I mentioned the stress on oil, but they've also had problems with regard to prices, and so inflation is a real concern for the Russians. And in addition to that, the National Bank of Russia has tried to combat this with interest rates. They're about 16%, I think, last time I checked, and they're losing that war. So the prices are rising faster than wages. This is a real vulnerability for Russia. The Duma recently increased the value-added tax. They're trying to get at this any way they can, but it shows that they're really vulnerable. And so, what does this mean with regard to the state of diplomacy? In the beginning, in the introduction, June talked about the U.S. role. The United States all along has been supporting Ukraine. Our policy, on paper at least, remains that we support Ukraine's sovereignty, that Ukraine has a right to exist. We also support Ukraine's territorial integrity. Throughout the Obama administration, which I was part of when the first invasion happened in 2014, then into the Trump first term, then Biden, and now Trump again. Again, all along, on paper at least, we've been supporting Ukraine. But under President Trump, of course, our support for Ukraine has decreased significantly. We are now providing it through the Europeans, and the Europeans are providing most of the economic support. So the military support is, yes, it's U.S. equipment, but it's coming because the Europeans are purchasing it from us. And economically, the Europeans are the ones who are putting in giving Ukraine the support it needs to keep the government and the country afloat. So the United States really is, for all intents and purposes, the biggest role that we play is diplomatic. And that one has also seesawed again, as June mentioned. And we have not, on the one hand, we have made it clear that we want peace. President Trump has made it clear that he wants peace, and everybody agrees we should have peace. The problem is, in order to have a real durable peace, you need a security guarantee for Ukraine. So, now I'm like speeding up to where do I think this is all headed? What are the sticking points? You've probably read about 28 points, and I don't know how many points. It doesn't matter how many points. The two sides are still very far away. Why do I say this? Because Russia is still insisting on getting not just the territory that it controls, where it has military forces right now, which is about 20% of Ukraine's territory, but it also wants, I think it's another 12% that it doesn't control. And it wants to achieve this at the negotiating table and just have the Ukrainians hand this over. For President Zelensky, that is a no-go. He cannot hand territory because territory actually is not territory, it's people. He would be handing those people over to Vladimir Putin. And he cannot do that. He cannot do that. And he runs a democracy. The Ukrainian people would not stand for that. There are some compromises that Ukraine could make. They could de facto say, okay, Russia, you can, govern Crimea and you can govern the parts of the east in Donetsk and Lugansk where you have forces for some indeterminate amount of time. But the Ukrainian government's been pretty clear that they will not accept that under international law. They will not cede de jure, so under international law, but de facto they say, well, maybe we can allow them to stay there. And I say this, they're not saying this publicly, but most analysts, most experts understand that that's one area where the Ukrainians could compromise. But where they will not compromise, having shed all of this blood, lost all these people to migration and maybe much of it permanent, the Ukrainians will not give up. They will not give up on a security guarantee. They want to make sure that Russia never does this again. And in the eyes of the Ukrainians, this goes all the way back to Soviet times when Stalin actually starved the Ukrainian people. So they talk about repeat assaults, invasions by the Russian government from Moscow on the Ukrainian people and on the Ukrainian territory. And they are adamant that the price for all of these people who have died, the price has been so high that the only outcome for peace will be a durable security guarantee. And what do I mean by that? And then I will kind of pivot us to questions. Essentially, the Ukrainians have to have a real security guarantee. It can't be the Budapest Memorandum, which was a political agreement. From my perspective, it should be something that's ratified by the United States Senate. It needs to have the United States involved. Why do I say this? Because Vladimir Putin, as you heard me say earlier, has not been deterred by the Europeans. Vladimir Putin's only afraid of the United States. So we need to be part of the security guarantee, and that means Article 5 guarantee. And an Article 5 guarantee means the Senate has to ratify it. It has to be almost automatic, the way Article 5 is. It's not technically automatic, but in the minds of the Russian government, Article 5 is something that is serious. If Ukraine can become a member of NATO, that's the best way, because then all the nations are, on Ukraine's side. If that's not possible, then I think the United States should give a bilateral agreement. And the only president in recent history who could give that kind of security guarantee, meaning get it through the United States Senate, is President Trump. So my view is that this war is not going to end anytime soon, not in this calendar year. The two sides are too far apart until we put more pressure on Russia through, as I mentioned, the military means, strikes in the hinterland, through economic pressure on the using sanctions and clamping down on the tankers. All of those things, until those things happen, until Russia realizes that the price is too high and that they cannot win with this foreign policy, unfortunately, the Ukrainians will fight on and the war will continue.
I'm afraid to say what? I'm afraid to say thank you,
I know. I'm sorry. It's
but thank you. Very in depth. Um, Sanctions have never worked terribly well, and Russia has buddies in China, Belarus, North Korea, which is dependent on them, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela. Can the Europeans supplant U.S. military arms support adequately to help Ukraine defend itself with all of these opposing countries standing with Russia and a whole host of undecided friends out there who would likely buckle and go with Putin?
Yeah. So, I mean, Europe has, incredible economic, military potential, economic real power, and then of course military potential. Russia's economy is the size of Italy's, or Texas. It's not a superpower economically. Of course, militarily it's another story, especially if you factor in the nuclear weapons. But Russia, of course, isn't going to use those nuclear weapons. We know that you have to fight this kind of war conventionally. And I think that the Europeans can counter and can give Ukraine enough to defend not just Ukraine but themselves. The question is how fast, and that's the problem, because the Europeans are struggling to get their defense industry up and running, and frankly to update their war plans to make sure that they can deter Putin. One of the, I think it was the New York Times, had a really good article on the German effort now to, essentially revamp all of their infrastructure, go back to the Cold War kind of planning and military mobilization, because they recognize that they're next. That if Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine, they are next. So the Europeans are benefiting from the fact that the Ukrainians are continuing to fight. They also could help Ukraine defeat Russia, but they just don't have right now the capacity. They don't have the ability to manufacture the weapons fast enough. And of course, they need some of them. If you look, though, at the frontline states, Poland and, of course, the Baltic states, they're the ones who are spending the most per capita on military, and they're the ones who have also given Ukraine the most because, again, they understand that right after Ukraine, they're next. So I think, Naomi, the Europeans can do it, but they need time. And this is the problem because many Europeans now have stated publicly, German intelligence, the Polish prime minister, that Putin is essentially already waging a war with them or against them.
I'll just remind everyone that when Putin was interviewed back early, right after he took power in Russia, he was asked to describe himself, and his instant response was, I'm a thug. And he has proven that to be real over and over. Tyler? Tyler?
Yeah, Evelyn, thanks so much for a wonderful capsule view of this total problem. I wonder how coherent you think U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine really is at this point. We have Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff meeting in Moscow with Dmitriev. Then we have Dan Driscoll, the head of the army, the other day, seeming to kind of run his own version of our diplomacy with Ukraine. And of course, then we've got Marco Rubio and maybe Trump, if he's really focused on it, in the background. So, what can you kind of give us your thoughts on whether you think we're doing a coherent job of dealing with this issue because there's so many players on our side seeming to be involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem here is this president's foreign policy is incredibly personal. Uh, Apparently, he's the one that can make decisions, no one else. And the people around him who he's empowered, I mean, they're at a disadvantage. First of all, the national security staff has been decimated. The State Department staff has been also cut and demoralized. A lot of the experts that I knew and worked with have left because they don't feel that this administration is sufficiently tough on Russia and supportive of Ukraine. So those are all things that make it harder for a coherent foreign policy to arise. But then, most significantly, is what you said. Nobody knows which envoy actually is in charge, who has the president's ear. I do think we've seen twice now, most recently over the weekend, Secretary Rubio jump in and kind of save the day. So my hope is that the guy who should be in charge, who's also the national security advisor, that he should be empowered to see this through, that the other envoys go and collect information and put proposals in front of, whether it's the Ukrainian government or the Russian government. But at the end of the day, I think that Secretary Rubio is the one who has the background and the knowledge. We know how he voted and what his perspective was when he was a senator. So my hope is that ultimately he will ensure that U.S. national security interests, not just Ukrainian or European interests, but our interests are best defended through the diplomacy, through the process of diplomacy.
Yeah. You really do wonder how anyone thought the initial 28-point plan would actually be productive. I mean, it was so totally anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia. that it was almost laughable. And the Europeans got totally upset by this. And so now we've got a kind of a watered down version, but still is certainly leaning towards favorability to Moscow. So,
Yeah, and
you
I
know,
think, Tyler, it adds to alarm that the Europeans have about the U.S. foreign policy perspective. Right now, I just came back from Halifax, Canada, I guess about a week ago. And there we heard from Canadians. Of course, they are really mad at us and very disappointed. But the Europeans too said, you know what, we realize that we can't rely on you. We have to go it alone. And I think this kind of issue with this 28-point plan only highlights for them the need for them to be more proactive.
yeah.
I had a question, one question. Ellen, what about this most recent over the last few days corruption scandals that are going on in the Ukraine right now? How's that going to impact Zelensky's ability to negotiate and going forward? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, Carolyn. So as I mentioned in my presentation, the corruption has been a perennial problem in
Yes,
Ukraine,
yeah.
but they have made progress all along. And one of the things that the demonstrators who were demonstrating against Yanukovych in 2014, they were demonstrating against corruption also, just as much as they were
Hmm.
demonstrating against or for or against a government that wanted to take them in the direction of Moscow as opposed to Brussels. So the when the new government was established after the elections in 2014, they set up anti-corruption bodies, which have been basically like oversight bodies. And more recently, it appears that President Zelensky was convinced by perhaps his chief of staff and other members of his cabinet to to cut back the power of these bodies. And in retrospect, because the people went to the streets and said, you can't do that, and President Zelensky backed down, so he didn't, he withdrew the piece of legislation that would have given more power to the prosecutor general who reports to the president as opposed to those oversight bodies. The the oversight bodies continued their work, and it turns out that now we know that the reason some of these people close to the president said you need to clamp down on these oversight bodies was that they were being investigated. So the good news is this has all come out, and that the anti-corruption bodies, there's one kind of oversight body, and then the other one's a prosecutor, and they have been impressive. In 15 months, they put together really solid cases, unfortunately, against cabinet members and other subordinates, reporting up to the president. And so President Zelensky is weakened by this. I'm glad that his chief of staff resigned. Whether he's involved or not, frankly, the president should have been aware of this. And if he wasn't aware of it, the chief of staff is kind of the first person you say, okay, you failed somehow, because it's your job to make sure the president knows what he needs to know. And corruption is, of course, almost an existential threat to Ukraine under the current circumstances, because, of course, the international community is providing them with money and arms. And we want to make sure our dollars are going not into some, official's pocket, but actually, to make sure that the government runs and that arms are getting to the battlefield. So I think that President Zelensky is weakened, but his government has done a good job in the sense that they've taken strong action against the individuals who have been investigated. They're continuing the investigation. And so we should just, really just applaud the Ukrainian civil society. It's demonstrated that it's quite strong, and it can really stand up to even this wartime president.
Thank you.
I have one more question from the chat from Harvey Dovelt. Can the EU seize $200 billion in frozen Russian assets held in Brussels and other European banks to fund Ukrainian military purchases, and what are the legal issues involved?
Yeah, so I think that I'm not an international lawyer, but I do know that most of the people involved in discussing the seizure and then providing these frozen assets. So it's somewhere between 200 to 300 billion dollars, most of it held in Brussels. I believe that these assets should be used to provide money and purchase weapons for Ukraine, and do things to refurbish the energy sector, for example. But the officials in Brussels are resisting because they're afraid that the Russian government will take action against them and some of their interests. And some people have also said that there's a negative precedent. So Europe has moved very incrementally. They've taken the interest from these accounts and they've provided loans to Ukraine with that interest. So I do think, however, that ultimately there's no other way. The war is going to continue. The Ukrainians are going to need the money to buy the weapons and to keep their state going. And that money is the easiest way to do it. So I think that eventually Europe will need to turn to that. The other thing I would say is that some of the like rationales for not unfreezing it have to do with, as I mentioned, Russians taking retaliatory action. But most of the companies like Total, which is a gas company, oil and gas company in which has assets in Russia, they've already written down those assets, is what I've been told. And the people who are proponents of unfreezing the assets also say that anyone who is targeted as a result of unfreezing the assets by the Russians, whether they're Polish or German or French, that those companies actually could create a mechanism for them to apply for some of this unfrozen money, if it becomes unfrozen, if they are negatively impacted, meaning they can also apply for restitution.
Do we know who Zelensky's backup is, successor? If he becomes an issue, we, by the way, are again nonpartisan, but if he is forced out by Trump, Vance, and the Senate, who might replace him and what are the implications?
Well, President Zelensky was elected. He was overwhelmingly popular when he was elected, again, because he said, I'm going to fight corruption and I'm going to end this war. And under the Constitution, the Ukrainian Constitution, they cannot hold elections while the country is in a state of war. This is actually similar to the German Constitution, which we drafted, the United States drafted, which says that you can't hold an election in Germany either until I think it's 6 months after the cessation of hostilities. So the Ukrainian people across the board understand that they can't hold a free and fair election under these circumstances. You just can't get the military back from the front to vote. You can't, I mean, it's just impossible. All the people overseas. So none of the Ukrainian civil society people or the opposition actually think that they should have an election before the war ends. But President Zelensky is no longer popular. I was in Ukraine last May, and across the board, everyone said, we want to change. The Ukrainian people want to change. The opposition is done with him. They think, they did not like his chief of staff. They felt that his government had become more centralized and controlling. And so, under war, you get that tendency. We've seen that in the United States as well when we were at war and our various presidents took greater control, if you will, to include martial law. So we want to support Ukraine in ending the war so that they can have free and fair elections, Naomi.
So a question that's been, that I've heard is that it's maybe time that we all sort of realize that Putin is not going to give up and that we should be changing our strategy rather than, going to the negotiating table and working this out. And maybe we need to look at possibly a containment policy, and just face the fact that we just have to limit um, Putin's actions in Ukraine, Europe, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no way Putin is giving up his objectives, and that maybe there's a containment. The danger, though, and the thing that's not acceptable to the Ukrainians is if that containment doesn't have a strong enough security guarantee because they don't want to live with that insecurity, the idea that Putin can reinvade. And so some of these proposals, like cutting Ukraine's armed forces, again, the inadequate or vague security, language with regard to security, those things are not acceptable to the Ukrainians. So I think that the international community, just as we've kind of gone along and accepted that Russia sits on 20% of Georgia's territory, now the Georgian government has become recaptured by the Kremlin politically. That's a whole nother conversation. um, but I just don't know if we can contain Putin. I think people are now at the point where they want to push for uh, really getting him to give up this imperial agenda. And it may mean a new leader, but I'm not sure whether Putin can be contained. Certainly we should try, but we can't do it without a security guarantee for Ukraine.
Uh,
Evelyn, on that theme, there is increasing evidence, very unfortunately, that Putin's military is gaining momentum relative to the standstill we seem to have had for the last many months. You've probably read the articles how their drones are getting smarter and more lethal than the Ukrainian drones, even though the Ukrainians have been very creative at developing their own drone industry. I just wonder, assuming the current talks break down and there's no resolution, and Trump and Putin continues the war, do you think Trump will kind of reverse himself, get tough again, and say, okay, I've mentioned these Tomahawk missiles before that we could employ against Russia? Do you think he'd actually push the button and give Ukraine maybe a big boost by allowing them to be used? I mean, that would be I think, a real change in the dynamics. But whether he
Yeah.
would do that, he's mentioned it. Whether he
Yeah.
would do it, I don't know. I wonder what your thoughts are.
I think it's possible, Tyler. I wouldn't rule it out. And if if Secretary Rubio is the last man to talk to him before he considers his next step, I think he would be the one to convince him to do that. The problem is that the problem is it seems that the president and Witkoff, for example, they really just want to go back to normal, if you will, with Russia. They want to do business with Russia. And they don't understand that the obstacle to the business is huge and cannot be negotiated without putting further pressure on Russia. So maybe eventually they will understand that. Maybe the president, or whether he understands or not, he will just say, okay, let's give them the tomahawks and see what happens, because he does, on some level, he certainly wants the war to end. He certainly is not a proponent of attacking, innocent civilians. He's spoken out about that, but yet he's continues to allow Putin to play for time. So, you know, I don't really know. I mean, I think if someone can convince him that the shortest path to doing business with Russia again is arming Ukraine, then yes.
what are the
There's an
economic
article in today. Oh, go ahead, Naomi.
what are the economic advantages for the U.S. to do business with Ukraine? They have a smart, well-educated population, rich minerals. What do you think?
Well, not only that, Naomi, but they have this they have the most capable, battle-hardened
Yeah,
military in all of Europe. We do
ready
not
to
want
go.
that military to fall into Russian hands. So that's another reason. And I've had Ukrainians say, we don't want to be in Russia's hands, but you don't want us to be in Russia's hands. And they're developing a cruise missile. Yes, I hear you, Tyler, that the Russians, it's a competitive process. And right now it looks like the Russians have a bit of the upper hand. But that could change. And the Ukrainians have been pretty clever at seizing the advantage when we least expect it. So I never count the Ukrainians out. But we do need to make sure that the Russians cannot hold this advantage. And part of that is not just taking out the oil facilities in the rear, but also these drone manufacturing plants. And that requires more than just Ukrainian drones, because if a drone hits, as I mentioned, a smaller bomb on it, if it hits a missile factory, the factory can continue. They just, one part of it will be damaged. So they need a really strong weapon, launched from a missile to actually hit that factory and take those factories out.
June, did you have a question?
I asked my question, um,
Okay.
but then I guess so there's no easy solution, I think you're sort of saying, other than the United States has to really step in with more military might to help Ukraine,
Yeah.
along
And
with other sanctions.
yes, and I'm looking at my friend Jay Forbes, who put something in the chat about, what's the acceptable peace treaty. I think the acceptable peace treaty is if we put pressure on Russia, where they say, okay, fine, we don't want any of the territory that we don't control. We would like to have de facto recognition that we govern Crimea and those places, the occupied territories in the east, in Donbass and Lugansk. We promise that we won't reattack. That so I think the Ukrainians would probably accept that as long as they don't have to sign legally and legally accept that Crimea and those territories are Russian. If they just say they're occupied, but we'll let Russia control them. That's one area of compromise. On the security guarantees, that's where I see less. It's really hard for me to imagine we would just have to force Russia and we would have to stick to our guns and say, look, Russia, you can't reinvade because if you do, you're going to be at war with NATO. But that is something that Putin is unwilling to accept. So that's where really we don't see likelihood for compromise.
Evelyn, do you think the Europeans are sufficiently ramping up their defenses, looking at this impending problem that could amount to an invasion eventually? I mean, the Germans are doing a lot. They've changed their legislative approach to arming and so forth and so on, but there's so many different countries involved in the EU. So the question would be, can the French Air Force, integrate with the German Air Force, et cetera, et cetera. It's a complicated issue. Do you sense they're doing a competent job?
Well, Tyler, I'm more worried. I'm not as worried about operationally, they'll get there and they have exercised together and they know how to work together. What I'm more worried about is whether they can get equipped sufficiently fast enough. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah, right.
what I said when Naomi asked, basically so the Polish foreign minister said in a closed meeting, and then he later said it publicly that I was at, he said, look, if we do everything we said we're going to do, which is 5 million, what is it? 5% of our GDP that we spend on defense, that in the amount of time they allocated for themselves, which I think is at least another 5 years, we will be able to defend ourselves against Russia. We will be able to push back and defeat Russia if we need to, right? Now, don't ask us to do anything in the Pacific or anywhere else, America, but we can take care of Europe, to include Ukraine, right? But the problem is the timeline. So again, I do worry that the Europeans are, they have a race against time. But this is where the faster they pedal and the more Putin sees them doing this fast pedaling, the less likely it is that Putin will decide to invade or to do something that's even more escalatory than what he's done so far. But I do think that they need to, again, have an Article 5 meeting and to say to the Russians, if you do any more of these attacks, we will counter with military force, proportionate, but we will counter with military force. So don't explode any bombs on our railroads if you don't want bombs to explode on your railroads. This is not a joke. That is an attack on the sovereign territory of NATO allies.
So I guess the question is that is the US then, I guess the US then is the backup military until we are supplying armaments to Europe. while they are ramping up. But then the question is, are we stretched too thin? Are we ramping up sufficiently to all the threats that are around us and to which we seem to also be increasing the threats ourselves and the demands on our military?
Yeah, I mean, look, the US spends 3% of its GDP on defense, which is historically actually like post World War II pretty low because of course during the Cold War we spent more. And we're in a kind of similar situation, so we probably do need to ramp up our spending, but it's not just an issue of spending, it's what do we spend it on? Because we spent a lot of money on these legacy systems, the so-called legacy systems, the big fighter aircraft and the submarines, and those are all important, but we also need to make sure we have the drones and we know how to fight now with the drones. We're learning quickly through the Ukrainians. And we need to ramp up production. So we have very much a very sclerotic, ponderous procurement process. And then the manufacturing is not up to capacity. We're not manufacturing at the right capacity. So yes, if Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea were to all decide, and by the way, the attack by Hamas on Israel happened while the war was raging in Russia, and we know that Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China are working together. If they were to, get together and really launch multiple attacks that impact US national security interests, we would be stretched. And so that is also a real concern for the United States. China is backing Russia's military war through economic support, through the purchase of oil, but also they've been providing dual use technology, drone engines, and things like that to chips to the Russians. We have not sufficiently countered that through our sanctions. Of course, we don't want a full out trade war with China, so that's part of the conundrum right now for the current administration and frankly previous administrations. So but we need to be aware that these guys are working together, and so we need to work more closely with our allies, not just in Europe, but in Asia.
Amy,
So
you got a question, I think?
yeah, I do. This is great, Evelyn. Thank you so much. Um, I'm mindful of time, but I wonder if there is any glimmer, any like little rays of optimism that you could point to of maybe some faltering in the Russian military. The Prigozhin incident, now feels like ancient history, but bringing in North Korean troops. Now there's reports that Africans are being sort of quasi-kidnapped and misled and conscripted to fight. I mean, is there a sense that the military perhaps is more brittle than it seems?
Yes, and so I mentioned earlier that, Amy, the Russians have been paying people, volunteers, to fight for them. And then, of course, there's also been the issue of the North Koreans and others being sent over as mercenaries. I think that somebody launched a case with the International Criminal Court saying that the North Korean government was guilty of human trafficking. So they had forced those military members to fight in Russia, which is interesting. Of course, under a dictatorship, nobody's volunteering. But the Russians have been the Russian treasury has been doling out a lot of money to these Russians and frankly not ethnic Russians, as I mentioned earlier, to fight. That is coming to an end. They just don't have the resources available to them anymore. So then Putin has turned to these mercenaries, and he will face a question about whether he has to really do another mobilization, and a mobilization that would impact the populations in Moscow and St. Petersburg. That it could be potentially politically tricky for him because, as I mentioned, this war is not popular. People go to fight it in order to make money. They don't, if Putin can get away with making it a war against NATO, which is partly why these small attacks, I think, are important to him, then the Russian people are more likely to say, well, we support you, President Putin, because we don't want NATO to take over Russia. But if it's a war against Ukraine, they don't understand that. They don't want to fight their Ukrainian brothers and sisters. So they view the war in Ukraine as a proxy war where the West is using the Ukrainians, if you will. So I think that if Putin were to do a general mobilization, and right now my understanding is that all he's doing is replenishing his forces. He's not able to get any additional numbers, which in theory, the Russians should be able to have more and raise more troops than the Ukrainians, but he has not been able to do that. So he would have to go to a general mobilization or another bigger mobilization, and that could be unpopular. And I do think no one should forget that Prigozhin mutiny, because there are real tensions in the Russian military. And you see, if you watch that Adivka film as well, the way they treat their dead, the way they treat the Russian conscripts, and the Russian conscripts also are not supposed to be sent to the front. These are like trainees, but they send them to the front, and they have no training, and that's why they're not supposed to be sent to the front, because they're not trained yet. But they send them to the front as cannon fodder, and we know from Russian history that the war in Afghanistan came to an end when the Russian mothers protested. They said, "We are done with these wars. We don't want to send our sons there anymore." And they literally went to the streets. And even though it was the Soviet Union and you had, Brezhnev in charge with the Politburo, and in that way, it was maybe a little more democratic than under Putin because he doesn't have a Politburo voting for things. But Brezhnev realized, you know what, we're not going to win this. The people are opposed. The mothers are opposed. And that was the beginning of the end, really, was those mothers demonstrating. And the Russians have always been keenly aware of that. I remember in 2014 when we saw the first evidence that the Russians were not sending the body bags back, because initially they sent them back, and then if a journalist wrote about the dead, they would end up getting beaten up and intimidated and told they can't write about it. The families were told to keep quiet, have a quiet funeral. And now, of course, as I mentioned, not all the bodies are going back. So it's and then the ones who have been captured, of course, the Russians who have been captured give the Ukrainians and the world a lot of intelligence on the condition of the armed forces with regard to their morale, etc.
Adding to
So, good
that,
question.
some of the
Okay.
North Koreans who were captured on the front in Ukraine reported that they thought they were fighting South Koreans. They didn't even know why they were there.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Carolyn, I cut you
Oh,
off.
no, I was just going to ask you, just to confirm sort of what Evelyn's saying, that there is not really a widespread desire within Russia to reconstitute the empire then. Most Russians could feel, so what, right? Is that true?
I mean, I think that they are nationalistic. They do want Russia to be a major power, and Putin came to power basically saying, "I'm going to make Russia great again." Like he was the original "make it great again" guy. And he did, in the sense that he built up Russia's military, he built up Russia's the Russian people's confidence. He used the oil and gas resources to, make Russians and certainly the elites wealthy. So in that sense, he did achieve that objective, but then he basically, squandered it all, especially with the full frontal invasion, because
Evelyn,
now
I
he's
saw.
a war criminal. Sorry. And the Russian people are suffering. They're starting to suffer economically. And the other thing is that the Ukrainian drones are now hitting targets. They're not intending to hit civilian targets, but they are hitting targets, in more populated areas, like, sometimes they'll hit an airport or a factory.
Tyler?
Evelyn, further to that issue of Putin disappointing the Russians in terms of what he could give them, I saw an interesting figure the other day that back in 2000, when he came to power, he promised Russians, loosely speaking, that they would soon, or I guess by 2020, in 20 years, they would have the world's fifth largest economy to be proud of. Well, guess where they are now? Number 11 in the world, and probably they're headed for 12 or 13 at the rate they're going. So big
Yeah.
disappointment.
Yeah, and the thing is that the Russian economy relies heavily on the extractive industries. And that's not necessarily a recipe for the future,
Yeah.
because we know, of course, that that the world will go more to renewables, whether anyone likes it or not, because China's leading the way and China has a big vote in this. In addition to that, the Russian population has been decimated. It was already on the decline before this war. And now the war, I mean, Putin has conducted also, frankly, a human rights, violation against his own people by sending all these young men to their deaths.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions, or are we ready to wrap up?
No, I think we
you're
should
ready.
wrap up. We're a little bit past our time, Naomi.
Right,
Evelyn,
right.
as always, you are amazing. And
Mhm.
thank you.
Thank you.
You
Thank
run the
you.
risk of being called back for service again.
Okay, okay.
Thank
Anytime.
you. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks,
Take care.
Evelyn.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Terrific.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
So,
Jim,
yes. So, Ellen,
over to you.
she was wonderful. We have another, program I think that's really wanting attention, and that's going to be Canada. So Monday, December 15th, we'll be talking about our neighbor Canada and now our estranged ally. We have two wonderful experts who are going to give us really their take on what's going on and why. We have Drew Fagan, who is a professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, who is currently a Fulbright visiting professor at Yale, and Brendan Shanahan, Associate Research Scholar at the Macmillan Center for International Affairs and Area Studies at Yale. So I tune in. I think this is a program where we're going to hear, I think, both from the US side and also from the Canadian side, their takes on what's going on. And also, on behalf of my colleagues in Chappaqua Library, may you have a wonderful holiday season with peace in the new year. So join us um, after this program, Monday, February 9th, when we'll begin our spring season with another wonderful speaker, Peter Nussler from the U.S. Department of State, speaking on Eastern Europe. So, a great program coming up in 2 weeks, and then look forward to the spring, although it's still winter, but our second semester when we will be starting our programs up again. So, we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. And thank you, Library and Joan, for hosting us, and we'll see you then.
Excellent. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Thanks,
for
Joan.
attending.